Grace Thompson smashed her elbow through the emergency glass so hard the shards cut into her skin. She didn't feel it. Behind that locked storage door, a baby was dying. She could hear him choking on his own cries, each one weaker than the last. She shoved the key in, twisted it, and threw the door open. Cold air hit her face. And there, inside a plastic holiday crate on the concrete floor, lay an 8-month-old boy, pale, shivering lips, cracked too weak to scream anymore. Edward Calloway's son. The billionaire's baby, locked away like garbage. But the woman who put him there. She was already walking down the hallway, heels clicking calmly, smile perfectly in place. What she didn't know was that Grace had just started a war she would never win. Stay with me through this whole story and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from right now. I want to see just how far this story reaches. If you're new here, subscribe and hit that bell. You don't want to miss what happens next. Grace Thompson heard the crying at 11:47 p.m. She almost missed it. 12 years of cleaning the Calloway mansion had trained her ears to filter noise, the hum of air conditioning, the click of automated locks, the distant drone of security cameras rotating on their mounts. But this sound didn't belong to the house. It was human, small, desperate. She stopped her cart in the middle of the service corridor and held her breath. Nothing. "You're tired," she whispered to herself. "That's all." She pushed the cart forward. 3 steps. Then the sound again, thin, broken trembling through the walls, like it was trapped inside them. A baby crying. Not fussing. Not whimpering. Crying the way a baby cries when it's been crying for hours and has almost given up. Grace's hands went cold. She abandoned the cart where it stood and moved fast down the corridor following the sound. It led her past the utility rooms, past the maintenance closets, deep into the storage wing, the part of the house nobody used at night. Old furniture, holiday decorations, forgotten things. The crying pulled her to a narrow door at the far end of the hall. She grabbed the handle. Locked. The cry came again right behind the door. Weaker now. Wet. Choking. "Oh, God," Grace said. She banged on the door with both fists. "Hello, is someone in there?" No answer. Just the baby coughing, gasping, running out of air and strength at the same time. Grace looked around wildly. Her eyes locked on the small emergency key cabinet mounted on the wall, a glass-fronted box Edward Calloway had installed years ago for exactly this kind of situation. She didn't hesitate. She drove her elbow through the glass. Pain shot up her arm. She didn't care. She grabbed the key, jammed it into the lock, and twisted. The door swung open. The smell hit first stale air urine, something sour and wrong. Then she saw him. Nathan Calloway. 8 months old, lying inside a large plastic storage container meant for Christmas ornaments. His skin was pale and clammy. His lips were dry and cracked. His onesie was soaked with sweat. His dark eyes stared up at Grace with a look no baby should ever have, not confusion, not even pain. Fear. "No, no, no, no." Grace dropped to her knees and lifted him. He was terrifyingly light. The moment he felt her warmth, his tiny fingers dug into her uniform and held on with everything he had. His crying softened into shuddering gasps, like his body was too exhausted to produce sound anymore, but too afraid to stop trying. "I got you," Grace whispered, pressing him against her chest. "I got you. You're okay. I promise." He wasn't okay. She knew it. She'd raised 3 children of her own before life took everything from her. She knew what a healthy baby felt like in her arms, and this wasn't it. This baby had been in this room for hours, maybe longer. His breathing was too fast. His heartbeat fluttered against her chest like a trapped bird. Grace pulled the thin blanket tighter around him and stood up, her mind racing. She needed water. She needed warmth. She needed to call someone. She turned toward the door. Vivian Ashford stood in the doorway. Grace froze. Vivian's blonde hair fell perfectly over her shoulders. Her silk robe was tied neatly at the waist. Her face carried exactly the right amount of shock. Wide eyes, parted lips, one hand rising slowly to her mouth. "Oh my God!" Vivian gasped. "What happened? What are you doing with my baby?" Grace stared at her. Her arms tightened around Nathan. "I heard him crying," Grace said. "He was locked inside. The door was locked." "Locked?" Vivian repeated, stepping forward. "That's impossible. Give him to me." She reached for Nathan. Grace didn't move. Something was wrong. Grace couldn't name it yet, but her gut screamed it. Vivian's hands were steady. Her breathing was even. Her mascara wasn't smudged. There were no tears on her face, no tremor in her voice. This was not a woman who had been frantically searching for a missing child. This was a woman who had just arrived at a scene she already knew about. "He's dehydrated," Grace said carefully. "He's cold. He needs—" "I said give him to me." Vivian's voice sharpened just for a second, then smoothed out again. She pulled Nathan from Grace's arms. The baby immediately began screaming louder, harder, his tiny body arching away from Vivian, his hands reaching back toward Grace. Vivian held him at arm's length, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Footsteps thundered from the main corridor. Edward Calloway appeared, tie-loose shirt untucked, face white with panic. "Where is he?" he demanded. "Where's Nathan?" "Rosa found him," Vivian said, tears suddenly appearing in her eyes like she'd turned on a faucet. "Someone locked our baby in a storage room, Edward. Someone locked him in there." She called her Rosa, Grace's real name. Nobody in this house called her that except the people who wanted to remind her she was the help. Edward took Nathan from Vivian's arms. The baby quieted slightly, his small body still shaking, but his eyes stayed locked on Grace. His hands reached for her. "Thank God," Edward whispered. He looked at Grace. Thank you, Grace." She nodded. She didn't trust her voice. Vivian wiped her eyes delicately. "She has experience with children," Vivian said, resting her hand on Edward's arm. "Maybe Grace should watch him tonight, just until things calm down. The poor thing is clearly attached to her." It sounded generous. It sounded thoughtful. But Grace heard what was underneath it. Vivian was handing off the baby she didn't want to hold, and making it look like kindness. Edward agreed. Of course he did. He always agreed with Vivian. That was how she'd built her position in this house, one perfectly timed suggestion at a time. Grace took Nathan to the guest nursery. She bathed him in warm water, fed him slowly, checked every inch of his body. No visible injuries, just dehydration, cold exposure, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from crying alone in the dark until your body simply quits. She held him until he fell asleep. Even then, she didn't put him down. She sat in the chair beside the crib Nathan pressed against her chest and listened to his breathing slowly steady. At 3 a.m., she heard footsteps in the hallway. Soft, deliberate. They paused outside the nursery door, lingered for exactly 10 seconds, then moved on. Grace didn't sleep. By morning, the house pretended nothing had happened. Staff moved through their routines. Coffee brewed. Schedules resumed. Edward left for his office downtown at 7:15 a.m., kissing Vivian on the cheek at the front door, briefcase in hand, the crisis already filed away in his mind as a terrible accident that had been resolved. Grace fed Nathan his morning bottle. He drank with desperate focus, his tiny hands gripping the bottle like he was afraid it would vanish. "Slow down," she whispered. "It's not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere." He looked up at her. Those dark eyes. Edward's eyes held something that wrecked her. Trust. Fragile, conditional, barely there trust, offered by a baby who had already learned that the world could lock him in the dark and walk away. Grace set the empty bottle down and burped him gently. That's when she noticed the formula container on the counter. She had sealed it tightly the night before. She always did. But now the lid sat to the side, the scoop beside it unwashed. She frowned. She stared at it for a long moment, then shook her head. "You're overthinking," she muttered. She wasn't. Vivian appeared in the nursery doorway at 9 o'clock, dressed like she was heading to brunch, cream blouse, gold earrings, perfume that cost more than Grace's monthly salary. "Good morning," Vivian said brightly. "How's our little man?" "He woke up twice," Grace replied, keeping her voice neutral. "He's still weak. I think the doctor should see him today." Vivian waved her hand. "Edward already called Dr. Simmons. Babies bounce back. They're resilient." Grace said nothing. She adjusted Nathan's blanket. Vivian stepped closer, peering down at the baby with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Did he eat?" "He did." "Good." Vivian straightened. "I have some errands this morning. You'll be fine here." "Yes, ma'am." Vivian turned to leave. Grace's voice stopped her. "Miss Ashford." Vivian paused. "There's a mark on his arm," Grace said carefully. "A bruise. It wasn't there last night when I bathed him." Vivian glanced back. Her expression didn't change. Not surprise, not concern, nothing. "He probably bumped himself in the crib," she said. "He's 8 months old," Grace said quietly. "He can't roll hard enough to bruise like that." Vivian's smile thinned. "You worry too much, Grace. That's sweet, but it's unnecessary." She walked out. Grace looked down at Nathan. The bruise was small reddish purple on his upper left arm. She touched it gently. He flinched. "I see you," Grace whispered. Not to the baby, to whatever was happening in this house. She opened the drawer of the small desk in the corner, pulled out a notepad she kept for grocery lists, and began writing. Date, time, location of bruise, size, color. Formula container found open sealed night before. Baby's condition dehydrated, frightened, flinching at loud sounds. She paused, then added one more line. Vivian showed no distress upon finding baby locked in storage room. Hands steady, no tears. Arrived after baby was found, not before. She tore the page out, folded it, and slid it into the lining of her work bag. That afternoon, Grace was folding towels in the staff room when Nathan started crying in the nursery. Not his hungry cry, not his tired cry. A sharp, panicked wail that made Grace drop everything and run. She found him in his crib, face red, legs kicking, eyes darting around the room like something had terrified him. She scooped him up and held him close. He quieted within seconds, his fingers gripping her collar. "Shh, shh. I'm here." She checked his diaper. Then she stopped breathing. The diaper tabs hadn't torn. They'd been cut. Clean, deliberate cuts like someone had taken scissors to them. The diaper hung loose, barely attached. Grace held it up and stared at it. Her hands began to shake. She heard heels on hardwood. Vivian appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, eyebrows raised. "Another problem?" Vivian asked lightly. Grace held up the diaper. "Someone cut this." Vivian tilted her head. "Cut it? That seems unlikely." "With scissors," Grace said firmly. "This wasn't a tear. It was cut." Vivian sighed. "Maybe the brand is defective. We don't buy cheap products in this house, but accidents happen." "This isn't an accident," Grace said. "This is dangerous. If the diaper falls off and he—" "Grace." Vivian's voice went flat. "Be very careful about what you're implying." Their eyes locked. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the mask slipped. Grace saw something behind Vivian's polished exterior. Not anger, not defensiveness, but cold, deliberate control. The look of someone running a plan and irritated that a variable wasn't cooperating. Then the mask returned. Vivian smiled. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said softly. "But I appreciate your dedication. I really do." She walked away. Her heels clicked evenly down the hallway. Not too fast, not too slow, perfectly measured. Grace looked at Nathan. He was staring at the doorway where Vivian had stood, his small body rigid against Grace's chest. "Yeah," Grace murmured. "I know." Edward came home at 7 o'clock. Grace heard his car in the driveway, heard him greet the security team at the gate, heard his shoes on the marble foyer. He moved through the house the way he always did, with the confidence of a man who believed his money could keep the world in order. He found Grace in the kitchen, warming Nathan's evening bottle. "How was he today?" Edward asked, loosening his tie. "He ate well," Grace said. "But I need to talk to you about something." Edward leaned against the counter. "Go ahead." Grace set the bottle down. "Sir, someone is tampering with Nathan's things." Edward's expression shifted. "What do you mean?" "The formula container I sealed last night was open this morning. The diaper he was wearing this afternoon had been cut with scissors, and there's a bruise on his arm that wasn't there when I bathed him last night." Edward was quiet for a moment. "You're sure about this?" "I've raised 3 children, sir. I know what I'm looking at." "That's a serious accusation, Grace." "I know it is." Edward studied her face. Grace met his eyes and didn't look away. She'd worked for this man for 12 years. She'd seen him close billion-dollar deals without blinking, fire executives without raising his voice, bury his first wife without shedding a public tear. She knew his face, and right now she could see the war behind it, the part of him that trusted her, fighting the part of him that didn't want to believe what she was saying. "I'll talk to Vivian," he said finally. Grace's stomach tightened. "Sir." "I said I'll handle it." His tone closed the conversation. Grace nodded. She picked up the bottle and went back to the nursery. Behind her, Edward stood in the kitchen, alone, staring at the counter, his jaw working silently. That night, after Edward and Vivian retired to the master bedroom, Grace sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the staff quarters and stared at her hands. They were rough, scarred. The knuckles on her right hand still ached from where she'd smashed the emergency glass. She'd cleaned the cuts and bandaged them herself. Nobody had asked about them. Nathan slept in the portable crib beside her bed. She'd moved it there without asking permission. If anyone had a problem with it, they could fire her. She reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook. She reread her entries. 3 pages now. Dates, times, observations. She added one more. Reported concerns to Mr. Calloway. He said he'd handle it. No action taken as of 10 p.m. She paused, pen hovering. Then she wrote something she'd been avoiding. "I lost my daughter Maya 7 years ago. She was 4 years old. Pneumonia. I was working a double shift when the fever spiked. By the time I got to the hospital, she was already gone. I have carried that weight every day since. I will not carry another child's death. Not in this house. Not while I'm breathing." She closed the notebook, tucked it back into the lining. Nathan stirred in the crib. His dark eyes blinked open, found her face in the dim light, and his body relaxed. His tiny hand reached out. Grace gave him her finger. He wrapped his whole fist around it and closed his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered. Somewhere above her, through the air vent near the ceiling, she heard Vivian's voice. Faint, muffled, but clear enough. "She's getting too close. We need to move faster." Silence. Then Edward's voice too low to make out. Then Vivian again, sharper this time. "I don't care what she thinks she saw. By the end of the week she'll be gone, and once she's out, everything goes back to plan." Grace sat motionless in the dark, her finger still wrapped in Nathan's fist, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She had 48 hours, maybe less, and the only weapon she had was a notebook, a bruise on a baby's arm, and 12 years of being invisible in a house that had just become the most dangerous place she'd ever known. Grace didn't sleep that night. She lay on her narrow bed with her eyes open, Nathan's small fist still wrapped around her finger, and listened to the house settle into silence above her. Vivian's words played on a loop inside her skull. By the end of the week, she'll be gone. And once she's out, everything goes back to plan. Back to plan. Which meant there was a plan. Which meant the storage room wasn't an accident, wasn't a mistake, wasn't a one-time lapse. It was a step. And whatever came next was already in motion. At 5 a.m. Grace got up, washed her face with cold water, and checked on Nathan. He was awake, lying still, watching the ceiling with wide, dark eyes. When he saw her lean over the crib, his whole body softened. His arms lifted. "Good morning," she whispered, picking him up. "You and me today. Same as yesterday. Same as tomorrow." She fed him slowly. He drank better this morning, still fast, still desperate, but steadier. His color looked better. His grip on the bottle was stronger. Small improvements that meant everything. Grace burped him, changed him, dressed him in a clean onesie. Then she checked his body the way she did every morning now. Arms, legs, torso, neck. The bruise on his upper arm had darkened overnight. She photographed it with the old phone she kept in her bag, the one nobody knew she had because nobody ever asked what a maid carried in her things. She wrote in the notebook, "Day 3. Bruise darker. No new marks. Baby eating better but still flinches at sudden sounds. Slept 4 hours total." At 7:30, Edward left for work. Grace heard him at the front door, heard Vivian's voice, bright, warm, the perfect fiancé, sending her man off to conquer the world. "Have a good day, darling. Don't worry about Nathan. Grace and I have everything under control." The front door closed. The car started. Gravel crunched under tires. Then silence. Grace stood in the nursery holding Nathan and counted to 60. On 58, she heard Vivian's heels coming down the hallway. Right on schedule. Vivian appeared in the doorway. Today she wore white, a fitted dress, gold bracelet, hair pulled back in a way that looked effortless, but probably took 30 minutes. She leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms. "We need to talk," Vivian said. "Yes, ma'am." "Edward told me about your concerns last night." Vivian's tone was pleasant, almost sympathetic. "The formula, the diaper, the bruise." Grace said nothing. She waited. "I appreciate how much you care," Vivian continued. "I really do. But I think you might be seeing things that aren't there. The diaper was cut with scissors, Ms. Ashford. Or it was defective. I've used that brand for 3 months, never had a problem." Vivian tilted her head. "Grace, can I be honest with you? I'd prefer that." Vivian pushed off the doorframe and walked slowly into the room. She stopped about 4 feet from Grace, close enough to lower her voice far enough to maintain the power dynamic. She'd calculated the distance. Grace was sure of it. "I know about your daughter," Vivian said softly. The words hit Grace like a fist to the sternum. Her arms tightened around Nathan involuntarily. "Edward told me." Vivian continued watching Grace's face with careful attention. "Maya, right? She was 4 when she passed. Pneumonia. You were working when it happened." Grace's jaw locked. She didn't speak. She couldn't. "Grief does terrible things to people," Vivian said, her voice dripping with manufactured compassion. "It rewires the brain. Makes us see danger where there isn't any. Makes us attach to things, to people, in ways that aren't healthy." "Don't," Grace said. "I'm not attacking you. I'm worried about you. Don't use my daughter to—" "I'm not using anyone." Vivian's voice hardened for half a second, then softened again. "I'm trying to help you see what's happening. You found Nathan in that storage room and it triggered something. That's understandable. But now you're projecting. Cut diapers. Open formula. Bruises that could come from anywhere. You're building a narrative because your mind needs one." Grace stared at her. Nathan squirmed against her chest, whimpering softly. "My mind is fine," Grace said quietly. "Is it?" Vivian smiled sadly. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like a woman who lost her child is desperately trying to save someone else's. And that's beautiful, Grace. It really is. But it's also dangerous." "Dangerous for who?" The question hung in the air. Vivian's smile flickered just for a moment, just enough for Grace to see the ice underneath. "For Nathan," Vivian said. "If you're so focused on finding threats that don't exist, you might miss the ones that do." She turned and walked out. At the door she paused without looking back. "I'd hate for Edward to think you're unstable. That would be terrible for everyone." Her heels clicked down the hallway. Steady. Measured. Gone. Grace stood in the nursery shaking. Not from fear, from rage. The kind of rage that starts in the chest and spreads outward until your fingertips buzz with it. Vivian had just done something precise and surgical. She'd taken the most painful thing in Grace's life and turned it into a weapon, a way to discredit everything Grace said and everything she would ever say. Who would believe the grieving maid? Who would trust the woman who lost her own child and now clung to someone else's? Vivian had built the frame in 60 seconds, and it fit perfectly. Nathan reached up and touched Grace's face. His small hand pressed against her cheek, and she realized she was crying. "Sorry," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "I'm sorry. That's not for you to worry about." But Nathan kept his hand there, his dark eyes watching her with something too old for an 8-month-old. Something that said, "I know. I know what she is too." Grace took a breath, then another. She sat down in the chair, held Nathan close, and made herself think clearly. Vivian had a plan. The plan was to isolate Grace, discredit her, and remove her from the house. Once Grace was gone, Nathan would have no one. Edward loved his son, but Edward trusted Vivian. He saw what she wanted him to see. He always had. Grace needed evidence, not feelings, not instincts, not a maid's word against a billionaire's fiancé. She needed something undeniable. She picked up her notebook and started a new page. What I know. Vivian accessed the storage room. Vivian showed no distress when Nathan was found. Vivian is escalating, sabotaging baby's care items and planting evidence to make me look incompetent. Vivian knows about Maya and is using it to build a case that I'm psychologically unstable. What I need proof, she's the one doing this. Security footage, access logs, witnesses. Something Edward can't explain away. She underlined the last sentence twice. Around 11 that morning, Vivian's friends arrived. 3 women in expensive clothes and louder jewelry, carrying bottles of wine and the kind of laughter that came from never having worried about anything real. Grace served drinks in the living room, while Nathan sat in a portable carrier beside her. "He's adorable," one of the women said, leaning toward Nathan. "Look at those eyes, so calm." "He's only calm with her," Vivian replied with a light laugh, gesturing toward Grace. "I swear he prefers the help over his own mother." The women chuckled politely. Grace kept her face neutral, her hands steady, her mouth shut. "That's actually not uncommon," another woman said. "My nanny's kids loved her more than us. It's a proximity thing." "Maybe," Vivian said, sipping her wine. "But it does make you wonder, doesn't it, about boundaries?" Grace set the last glass down and stepped back. She felt the conversation shifting the way water shifts before a current pulls you under. "What do you mean?" the first woman asked. Vivian lowered her voice, but not enough. "I probably shouldn't say anything." "Oh, come on." Vivian sighed, performative rehearsed. "It's just..." After the incident the other night, Grace has been different. Hovering. Emotional. Edward thinks it's dedication, but I'm not so sure. "What incident?" "Nathan was found in a storage room, locked inside. We still don't know how it happened. Grace found him, which was wonderful, but since then she's been attached. Almost possessively so." The women exchanged glances. Grace stood 3 feet away, invisible, the way servants are always invisible, hearing every word. "That's concerning," one woman whispered. "Is it safe with your baby?" Vivian pressed her lips together. "Edward trusts her. And I don't want to be the kind of woman who fires the help over a feeling. But between us..." She paused. "I lock my bedroom door at night now." Grace's blood turned to ice. In one casual conversation over wine, Vivian had just made her a threat. Not with accusations, not with evidence, with implication. A concerned mother confiding in friends. A whisper that would spread to other whispers, to Edward's social circle, to anyone who mattered. Nathan began crying. Loud, sudden, panicked, the kind of cry that made everyone in the room flinch. "Oh dear," the first woman said. "Is he all right?" Grace picked him up immediately. She checked everything: diaper, temperature, position. Nothing was wrong. But Nathan screamed and screamed, his face red, his body rigid. "Maybe you should take him to another room," Vivian said coolly. "You seem a bit overwhelmed." "I'm not overwhelmed," Grace said, rocking him gently. "Well, something's clearly wrong," Vivian replied, her eyes flicking to her friends. "And it's upsetting everyone." Grace carried Nathan to the kitchen. It took nearly 20 minutes for him to calm down. She held him against her chest, swaying slowly, humming a song she used to sing to Maya, a habit so deep she didn't even realize she was doing it until the melody was already out. Nathan's breathing steadied. His fingers relaxed. He pressed his face into her neck and went still. "Good boy," she murmured. "Good boy. Nothing's going to happen to you." When he was calm, she walked back toward the living room to check if the guests needed anything. She stopped short in the hallway. Vivian's voice carried clearly. "I worry about her," Vivian was saying softly. "I do. She lost a child years ago, a daughter, 4 years old. And I think finding Nathan in that room triggered something deep. Trauma, it does things to people." "Oh my God," a woman whispered. "That's heartbreaking." "It is, but heartbreaking doesn't mean safe. I've tried talking to Edward about it, but he feels guilty. He thinks he owes her because she's been here so long, and maybe he does. But at what point does loyalty become a liability? You should trust your instincts, Vivian. A mother knows." "That's what I keep telling myself." Grace stood frozen in the hallway, her cheek pressed against Nathan's head, and felt the walls closing in. 12 years. She had given 12 years to this house. She had cleaned its floors, washed its windows, organized its closets, served its meals, endured its loneliness. She had been invisible when it was convenient and present when it was needed. And in the space of 2 days, Vivian Ashford was turning all of it into evidence of instability. That evening, Edward called Grace into his study. The room smelled like leather and old books. Edward sat behind his desk, tie-loosened reading glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. He looked tired. The kind of tired that came from carrying questions he didn't want to ask. "Sit down, Grace." She sat. Nathan was asleep in the nursery with the baby monitor clipped to Grace's belt. "Clara Vivian told me there were some issues today," Edward said. "Crying fits, problems during the luncheon." "He cried, sir. Babies cry." "She said you seemed overwhelmed." Grace folded her hands in her lap. "I wasn't overwhelmed." "She also said you've been emotional, that you've been having trouble separating." "Sir." Grace's voice was steady, but her eyes burned. "Someone is tampering with your son's belongings. Someone is hurting him, and instead of investigating that, you're asking me if I'm emotional." Edward leaned back. His jaw worked silently. "I'm not accusing you of anything," he said carefully. "But you're not accusing anyone else either." The silence between them filled the room like smoke. Edward removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Grace, you've worked here for 12 years. I trust you, but I also trust Vivian, and right now I'm getting 2 very different versions of reality, and I need to figure out which one is true." "Then check the security cameras," Grace said. Edward paused. "What?" "The storage wing, the nursery, the hallways. You have cameras everywhere in this house, sir. Check the footage from the night Nathan was locked in that room. Check who went where and when." Edward studied her for a long moment. "I'll look into it." "Tonight," Grace said. "Please." Something in her voice, the urgency, the rawness, made Edward sit up straighter. "All right," he said slowly. "Tonight." Grace stood. At the door, she turned back. "Mr. Calloway, I know how this looks. A maid accusing your fiancé. I know what people will think. I know what your friends will say. But I need you to hear me." She took a breath. "That baby is not safe, and the person hurting him is counting on the fact that nobody will believe me." She left before he could respond. Outside the study, the hallway was empty. But as Grace passed the staircase, she glanced up and saw Vivian standing at the top of the stairs, leaning against the railing, watching her. Their eyes met. Vivian smiled. Slow, confident. The smile of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the scoreboard to update. Grace held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and walked to the nursery. She checked the monitor. Nathan was still asleep. She sat down beside the crib and opened her notebook. Day 3 evening. Reported concerns to Mr. Calloway again. He agreed to check security footage tonight. Vivian has told her friends I'm unstable, grieving, possessive. She's building a case to have me removed. If that happens, Nathan will have no protection. The cameras are the only chance. If the footage shows Vivian in the storage wing that night, everything changes. If it doesn't, if the footage has been deleted, then I need another way. She closed the notebook and sat in the dark, listening to Nathan breathe. At 10 p.m., her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Cameras in the storage wing were offline from 9 p.m. to midnight the night of the incident. Someone disabled them manually. Grace stared at the screen. Her hands went cold. A second message came through. This is Helen Marsh, head of security. Don't reply to this number. Meet me in the staff kitchen at 6 a.m. Come alone. Grace deleted both messages. She set the phone down and pressed her palms against her eyes. The cameras were disabled. Someone had planned it. Someone who had access to the security system, who knew the schedules, who could move through this house without suspicion. She thought of Vivian at the top of the stairs smiling down at her. Of course she smiled. She thought she'd covered her tracks. Grace lay down on her bed, pulled the blanket over her shoulders, and stared at the ceiling. Nathan sighed in his sleep beside her, a small sound of surrender to exhaustion. We're not done, Grace whispered to the dark room. Not even close. At midnight, she heard footsteps again. Same pattern as the night before, slow, deliberate pausing outside her door. This time, Grace got up silently and pressed her ear to the wood. Breathing on the other side. Shallow. Patient. Then a whisper so faint, Grace almost missed it. Vivian's voice. Enjoy it while it lasts. The footsteps moved on, faded down the hall, disappeared into the silence of the house. Grace's hands were shaking. She picked up Nathan's crib and moved it to the far corner of the room, away from the door. She wedged the desk chair under the door handle. Then she sat on the floor between the crib and the wall, her back against the plaster, her eyes on the door, and waited for morning. At 5:45 a.m., Grace washed her face, changed her uniform, fed Nathan, and carried him to the staff kitchen. Helen Marsh was already there, sitting at the small table in the corner with a tablet in front of her and a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. Helen was in her late 50s, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of face that gave away nothing until she decided it should. She'd run security for the Calloway estate for 8 years. She and Grace had never been close. Helen kept to her team, Grace kept to her work, but they had the kind of mutual respect that came from sharing a house without getting in each other's way. "Close the door," Helen said. Grace closed it. She sat across from Helen. Nathan balanced on her lap. "The cameras," Grace said. Helen nodded. "Disabled manually from the main security panel. Someone entered the override code between 8:47 and 8:52 p.m., 5 minutes before the storage wing feeds went dark." "Who has the override code?" "3 people, Mrs. Edward and Vivian." Grace exhaled slowly. "It wasn't you." "No. And Edward was in his study all evening. I brought him coffee at 9. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then she turned the tablet around. The cameras were off, but the biometric locks weren't. The storage wing doors use fingerprint access. Every entry is logged, who, when, how long. Grace leaned forward. On the screen was a list of entries, timestamps, names. "Your fingerprint doesn't appear once," Helen said. "Not that night. Not any night in the past 6 months." Grace's breath caught. "But here." Helen pointed to 3 entries highlighted in yellow. Vivian Ashford, 9:14 p.m., 10:03 p.m., 11:38 p.m. 3 separate entries to the storage wing on the night Nathan was locked inside. Grace stared at the screen, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. "She went back 3 times," Grace whispered. 3 times, Helen confirmed. The first entry was 40 minutes after the cameras went dark. The last was 20 minutes before you found him. Grace held Nathan tighter. He stirred against her chest, making a small sound, then settled. "Why are you showing me this?" Grace asked. Helen picked up her coffee, looked at it, set it back down. "Because I've been watching the same things you've been watching. The bruises, the formula, the way that baby screams when she picks him up. And I've been telling myself it's not my business, that I'm paid to secure the property, not the people." She paused. "But I heard what she said through the vent last night, about finishing it, and I can't unhear that." "Will you tell Edward?" Helen met her eyes. "He hasn't asked me to pull the logs. He said he'd look into the cameras, and when he finds out they were disabled, he'll either dig deeper or he'll accept whatever story Vivian feeds him. And based on what I've seen, I think she's already got an explanation ready. So what do? We wait for the right moment. When he asks, and he will ask, because that man loves his son, even if he's blind right now, we give him everything at once. The logs, the timestamps, the pattern, all of it. One shot, no room for her to spin it." Grace nodded slowly. "And if he doesn't ask?" Helen leaned forward. "Then we go around him. Child Protective Services, police, whatever it takes." She paused. "I've got 30 years in security. I've guarded diplomats, executives, people who could buy this house 10 times over. And I've never seen anything as cold as what that woman is doing to that baby. So you tell me, Grace, are we doing this?" Grace looked down at Nathan. He was awake now, his dark eyes staring up at her, his tiny hand gripping the collar of her uniform. "We're doing this," she said. Helen nodded once. "Then we move carefully. She's smart, Grace. She's smarter than Edward gives her credit for. She'll sense it if we change our behavior. So you keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Feed the baby, clean the house, document everything. Don't confront her again. Don't give her ammunition. And you. I'll pull every log, every record, every access entry from the last 3 months. Quietly. Off the main system. She won't see it coming." Grace stood up. Nathan yawned and pressed his face into her shoulder. "Helen," Grace said at the door. "Yeah. Thank you." Helen shook her head. "Don't thank me yet. We haven't won anything. We've just decided to fight." Grace carried Nathan back to the nursery. She changed him, dressed him, settled him into the crib with his blanket. He watched her with those dark, knowing eyes. "You heard all of that, didn't you?" she murmured. He blinked at her. His hand reached up. She gave him her finger. He held on. Somewhere above them, a door opened and closed, heels on hardwood. The sound of Vivian starting her day, showered, perfumed, polished, already rehearsing whatever mask she'd wear for the next 12 hours. Grace looked at the ceiling, then back at Nathan. "Hold on, baby," she whispered. "Just a little longer. We're almost there." Nathan closed his eyes. His grip on her finger didn't loosen. If anything, it tightened, tiny, fierce, unbreakable, as if even at 8 months old, he understood that the woman holding his hand was the only thing standing between him and the dark. Helen's warning lasted less than 12 hours. Grace had done everything right that morning. She fed Nathan at 6, bathed him at 7, documented the fading bruise on his arm at 7:15. She cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, polished the hallway console tables. Every task performed with the mechanical precision of a woman who knew she was being watched. She didn't look at the security cameras. She didn't glance toward the storage wing. She kept her eyes down and her hands busy and her mouth shut. But Vivian moved faster. At 9:30, Vivian came downstairs carrying Nathan's car seat. She set it on the kitchen counter with a thud that made Grace flinch. "I'm taking Nathan out today," Vivian announced. "Mommy and baby day. We need bonding time." Grace's hand stopped mid-fold. She held a dish towel in her fist knuckles, whitening. "He hasn't finished his morning bottle," Grace said carefully. "He can finish it in the car." Ms. Ashford, the doctor, said he needs to stay on a consistent feeding schedule. His weight is still... Grace. Vivian's smile was bright and sharp. "I'm his mother. I don't need permission from the cleaning staff to take my own child out of the house." Grace set the towel down. "Where are you going?" "I don't think that's any of your business." "Mr. Calloway would want to know." Vivian's eyes narrowed. The sweetness drained from her face for just a moment, a flash of the real thing underneath, and then it was back smooth and polished as glass. "Edward knows," Vivian said. "I texted him this morning. He thinks it's a wonderful idea." She tilted her head. "You can call him if you'd like, but I'd hate for him to think you're being difficult again." The word landed like a slap. Again. As if Grace had been difficult before. As if everything she'd done finding Nathan, feeding him, protecting him, documenting every bruise and cut and planted piece of evidence was difficulty rather than devotion. Grace looked at Nathan in the car seat. He was awake, his dark eyes wide, his body rigid. He wasn't crying. He was doing something worse. He was silent, watchful, bracing himself the way a child braces when it knows what's coming. "Can I at least pack his bag?" Grace asked. Vivian waved a hand. "Fine. 5 minutes." Grace went to the nursery. She packed the diaper bag with trembling hands, bottles, formula diapers, a change of clothes, the soft blanket Nathan liked to grip when he slept. She slipped her phone into the side pocket of the bag where Vivian wouldn't notice it. Then she pulled out her notebook and wrote quickly. Day 4, 9:35 a.m. Vivian, taking Nathan out alone. Refused to say where. Claims Edward approved. Baby showing signs of fear. Silent, rigid, not making eye contact with Vivian. Phone placed in diaper bag. She tucked the notebook away and brought the bag to the kitchen. Vivian took it without looking inside. She lifted the car seat off the counter, Nathan swinging in it, his hands gripping the straps. At the door, Vivian paused. She turned back to Grace with a look that was almost pitying. "You should use this time to rest," Vivian said softly. "You look exhausted, and honestly, I think some distance would be good, for both of you." She walked out. The front door closed. Grace heard the car start, heard the tires on gravel, heard the gate open and shut. Then nothing. Grace stood in the empty kitchen, and for the first time since she'd found Nathan in that storage room, she felt completely powerless. He was gone. Out of the house, out of her reach, alone with the woman who had locked him in the dark and whispered about finishing it. She pulled out her phone, her personal one, not the one in the bag, and called Edward. It rang 4 times. 5. Voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. A 3rd time. This time he picked up. "Grace, I'm in a meeting. Is everything... Did you tell Vivian she could take Nathan out today?" Silence on the line. Then, what? "She said she texted you this morning. She's taking Nathan somewhere. She left 5 minutes ago." "She didn't text me anything." Edward's voice changed, the calm, controlled tone he used in business meetings, sharpened into something urgent. "Where is she going?" "She wouldn't tell me." "Grace, I'll call her. Stay at the house." "Sir." He was scared. The way he looked when she... "I said I'll handle it. Stay there." The line went dead. Grace lowered the phone and stared at the screen. Her reflection stared back, exhausted, afraid, alone. She had done what she could. Now she had to wait. And waiting, she realized, was the cruelest part. Because waiting meant trusting that Edward would act, and trust was the one thing she was running out of. 40 minutes passed. An hour. Grace cleaned the nursery, twice rearranged the bottles, wiped down surfaces that were already spotless. She checked her phone every 90 seconds. At 11:15, the front gate buzzed. Grace rushed to the window. Vivian's car pulled up the driveway. The engine cut off. Vivian stepped out perfectly composed and lifted the car seat from the back. Grace met her at the door, Nathan was asleep in the car seat, his face flushed, his breathing slightly fast. "He's tired," Vivian said casually, handing the car seat to Grace. "We went to the park. Fresh air. Good for him." "Edward didn't know you were going." Vivian paused, one hand still on the door. "Excuse me. He said you didn't text him." Something shifted behind Vivian's eyes. A recalculation. Grace could almost see the gears turning. "I sent it this morning," Vivian said smoothly. "Maybe it didn't go through. You know how reception is in his office." He was worried. Then he should worry less. Vivian stepped inside and walked past Grace without another word. Grace carried Nathan to the nursery. She unbuckled him from the car seat and lifted him out. He woke immediately, his eyes finding her face, his body relaxing. "Mama," he whispered. Grace's chest cracked open every time he said it. She checked him, arms, legs, torso. No new marks. But something else caught her attention. His onesie was different. Not the one she'd dressed him in that morning. A new one, pale blue, expensive tags still attached inside the collar. She checked the diaper bag. The clothes she'd packed were still there unused. Someone had changed Nathan into a new outfit. And the old one, the one Grace had put on him that morning, was gone. Grace's mind raced. Why change his clothes? What was on the original outfit? A stain. A mark. Evidence of something that happened during the outing. She searched the car seat. Nothing. She checked the diaper bag's side pocket. Her phone was still there, but it had been turned off. Grace always left it on. Someone, Vivian, had found the phone, turned it off, and left it in the bag. A message. "I know what you're doing." Grace sat down heavily in the chair beside the crib. Nathan reached for her hand. She gave it to him. "I know," she murmured. "I know." That afternoon, Edward came home early. Grace heard the front door open at 2 o'clock hours ahead of his usual schedule. His footsteps moved fast through the house, and then his voice, low and tense, coming from the living room. "Why didn't you tell me you were taking him?" Vivian's response was calm, measured. "I did tell you. I texted you at 7:30. My phone shows no message from you, Vivian." "Then check again. Maybe you deleted it by accident. You know you do that sometimes when you're swiping through emails." "I didn't delete anything." "Edward, I took our son to the park. For an hour. That's it. I don't understand why this is becoming a crisis." "Because Grace called me in a panic." A pause. Then Vivian's voice, lower now, wounded. "Grace called you?" "Yes. And you believed her. Over me. She said you didn't tell her where you were going." "Because I don't answer to the maid, Edward. She works for us. I'm Nathan's mother. The fact that I have to defend myself for spending an hour with my own child, do you hear how insane that sounds?" Another pause. Grace stood in the hallway, Nathan in her arms, listening to the conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. "You're right," Edward said quietly. "I overreacted." "You did. But from now on, let me know before you take him anywhere. Just so we're on the same page." "Of course, darling. I always do." Grace closed her eyes. He'd folded, again. Vivian had challenged him with the one argument he couldn't counter. I'm his mother, and he'd backed down. Because in Edward Calloway's world, that statement was sacred. The mother was beyond suspicion. The mother was always right. And anyone who questioned the mother, especially a maid, especially a black maid who'd lost her own child, was the one with the problem. Grace carried Nathan back to the nursery and closed the door. She sat down and pulled out her notebook. Day 4 afternoon. Vivian returned with Nathan in different clothes. Original outfit missing. Phone found turned off. She knows I planted it. Edward confronted her about the outing. She denied, deflected, turned it back on me. Edward backed down. Pattern: every time I raise a concern, Vivian makes it about my credibility. She is not defending herself. She is prosecuting me. Grace stared at what she'd written. That last sentence stared back at her, and she knew it was the truth. This wasn't a woman caught off guard by accusations. This was a woman running an offense disguised as defense. Every move Grace made, Vivian countered. Every piece of evidence Grace gathered, Vivian anticipated. She needed to stop reacting. She needed to get ahead. Grace picked up her phone and sent a text to the number Helen had used the night before. 3 words. "She's accelerating." 3 minutes later, Helen replied, "I know. Come to the security office at 10 tonight. I have something." The rest of the afternoon crawled. Grace moved through her duties like a ghost, cleaning, cooking, serving dinner. Vivian was radiant at the dinner table, telling Edward about a charity event she wanted to attend next month, laughing at his jokes, touching his arm with practiced tenderness. Nathan sat in his high chair, barely eating, watching Vivian with the stillness of an animal that knows a predator is in the room. At one point during dinner, Vivian reached over and stroked Nathan's cheek. He recoiled so violently that his spoon clattered to the floor. "Oh, come on!" Vivian laughed. "Really, I'm your mother, not a monster." Edward chuckled uncomfortably. "He's just in a mood." Grace picked up the spoon and said nothing. After dinner, she bathed Nathan, fed him his last bottle, and settled him into the crib. He gripped her finger, his eyes fighting sleep, as if staying awake meant staying safe. "I'll be right here," she whispered. "Close your eyes. I'm not leaving." He surrendered to exhaustion at 8:45. Grace waited until his breathing deepened, then slipped out of the nursery and made her way to the security office on the far side of the house. Helen was waiting. The room was small, windowless, lined with monitors showing feeds from cameras throughout the estate. Helen sat at the main console, the light from the screens casting sharp shadows on her face. "Close the door," Helen said. Grace closed it. "I pulled 3 months of biometric access logs," Helen said without preamble. "Every fingerprint entry, every door in this house." She turned the main monitor toward Grace. "Look at this." The screen showed a spreadsheet, dates, times, locations, names. Helen scrolled slowly. The first 3 weeks after Vivian moved in, her access pattern was normal. Main entrance, kitchen, master bedroom, living areas. Exactly what you'd expect from someone settling into the house. Helen scrolled further. Then 6 weeks ago, something changed. She started accessing the storage wing. Not during the day, always at night. Between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Once or twice a week at first. Then 3 times. Then every other night. Grace leaned forward. What was she doing in there? "I don't know yet. The cameras in that wing have been intermittently disabled 17 times in the last 6 weeks. Always the same window a few hours at night, always restored before dawn. Someone with the override code." Vivian. "The log doesn't lie. Her fingerprint is on every storage wing entry. Edward's isn't. Mine isn't. Nobody else's is." Grace's heart was hammering. "This is it. This is the proof." Helen held up a hand. "There's more." She pulled up another file. "I went through the household purchase records. Things Vivian bought with the house credit card. Most of it's normal clothes, beauty products, baby supplies. But buried in there 3 weeks ago, she bought something from a medical supply company." "What?" "Sedatives. Low-dose infant sedatives. The kind they use in pediatric clinics for minor procedures." Grace felt the floor shift beneath her. She's drugging him. "I don't know. But she bought them, and there's no medical reason for it. Nathan doesn't have any procedures scheduled. I checked with Dr. Simmons's office." Grace pressed her hands flat on the desk to stop them from shaking. "That's why he's been so quiet. That's why he sleeps so heavily and then wakes up screaming. She's sedating him, and when it wears off, he panics." Helen finished. "Because the last thing he remembers before going under is her." Grace stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. "We need to tell Edward. Now. Tonight." "Not yet." "Helen? She bought sedatives for a baby. She's been in and out of that storage wing for weeks. What more do we need? We need it organized. Airtight. If we go to Edward with pieces, Vivian will pick them apart. She'll say the sedatives were a mistake. A wrong order, she meant to return them. She'll say the storage wing visits were to check on decorations or inventory. She'll have an answer for everything, Grace. She always does. Grace paced the small room. Nathan was upstairs, asleep, in a house with a woman who had purchased drugs to sedate him. "How long?" Grace asked. "Give me 24 hours. I'll compile everything. The access logs, the purchase records, the camera override history. I'll put it in a format Edward can't deny and Vivian can't spin. And I'll make copies, 3 of them. One for Edward, one for us, and one for the police." "The police?" "If Edward doesn't act, we go straight to Child Protective Services and law enforcement. No more waiting for him to decide. No more hoping he opens his eyes." Grace stopped pacing. She looked at Helen. This woman she'd barely spoken to in 8 years. This quiet, steady, unshakable woman who had chosen to step out of her lane and into the fire. "Why are you doing this?" Grace asked. Helen was quiet for a moment. She looked at the monitors, the empty hallways, the dark rooms, the sleeping house. "I had a sister," Helen said. "Younger than me. She married a man who everyone said was wonderful, charming, generous, successful." She paused. "He put her in the hospital 3 times before she finally left. And every single time someone could have spoken up and didn't. Because it wasn't their business. Because they didn't have enough proof. Because they were afraid of being wrong." She looked at Grace. "I'm not afraid of being wrong. I'm afraid of being silent." Grace nodded. No more words were needed. She went back to the nursery and sat beside Nathan's crib. He was still asleep, his breathing deep and even. Too even. Grace leaned closer and studied his face. His eyelids didn't flutter. His fingers didn't twitch. He lay completely still, like a doll. Grace's stomach turned. She lifted his arm gently. It fell back, limp. She checked his pulse, steady but slow. Slower than normal. She had been drugged. Tonight. Before Grace put him to bed. Grace went cold. She ran through the evening in her mind. She had prepared his bottle herself. She had watched him drink it. She had burped him, changed him, laid him down. But there was a moment, one moment when she had stepped out of the nursery to get a clean towel from the hall closet. 30 seconds. Maybe 40. Enough time for someone to add something to a bottle that was already 3/4 empty. Grace lifted Nathan carefully. His body was heavy with unnatural sleep. She held him against her chest, feeling his slow heartbeat against hers, and made a decision. She would not leave this room. She would not close her eyes. She would not let him out of her arms until morning. And tomorrow, when Helen's evidence was ready, Grace was going to burn Vivian Ashford's perfect world to the ground. At 2 a.m., footsteps in the hallway. Grace was awake, sitting in the dark, Nathan heavy and still against her chest. The footsteps stopped outside the nursery door. The handle turned slowly, tested, locked. A pause. Then a soft knock. "Grace?" Vivian's voice barely a whisper. "Are you awake?" Grace didn't answer. She held Nathan tighter and stared at the door. Another knock. Softer this time. "I know you're in there," Vivian whispered. "I can hear him breathing." Silence. Grace didn't move. Didn't breathe. "You think you're protecting him," Vivian said through the door, her voice so low it was almost inaudible. "But you're just delaying things. Edward is mine. This house is mine. And that child is a complication I never agreed to." Grace's jaw clenched so hard her teeth ached. "You should have stayed in your lane, Grace. You clean floors. You fold towels. That's what you are. That's all you'll ever be. And when I'm done, not even Edward will remember your name." The footsteps retreated. Slow. Measured. Gone. Grace sat in the darkness, Nathan's drugged body warm and still against hers, and felt something shift inside her. Not fear, not anger. Something harder, sharper, more permanent. Certainty. She wasn't a maid anymore. She wasn't staff. She wasn't the help. She was the only thing standing between this child and the woman who wanted him gone. And tomorrow she would prove it. Nathan stirred slightly, the sedative losing its grip. His fingers twitched against her collarbone. His breathing quickened. A small whimper escaped his lips as consciousness crept back in, bringing with it whatever fragments of fear his drugged mind had been holding at bay. "Shh," Grace murmured, rocking him. "I'm here. I'm right here." His eyes opened glassy and confused. He blinked twice, found her face in the darkness, and his whole body curled into hers. "Mama," he breathed. Grace pressed her lips to his forehead and held him as the night bled slowly toward dawn, toward the 24 hours that would decide everything, toward the moment when 12 years of silence would finally violently, irrevocably end. Dawn came hard and fast. Grace hadn't moved from the chair. Nathan slept fitfully against her chest, waking every 40 minutes with sharp gasps, his fingers clutching at her uniform before his eyes even opened. Each time Grace whispered the same words, "I'm here, I'm here." And each time he settled, not because the words meant anything to an 8-month-old, but because her voice did. Her voice meant safety. Everything else in this house meant danger. At 6:15, Grace's phone buzzed. "Helen, it's ready. Everything compiled. 3 copies made. 1 encrypted on a flash drive, 1 printed, 1 uploaded to a secure cloud backup. She can't touch." "When do we move?" Grace typed back with one hand. Nathan balanced on the other. "Today. Before she does something we can't undo." Helen's reply came in 10 seconds. "Edward gets home at 6. I'll have everything set up in the study. Get the doctor and child welfare there by 6:30. Don't tell Vivian. Don't tell anyone." Grace deleted the messages, cleared her phone history, and put it away. Then she looked down at Nathan. He was awake now, staring up at her with those dark eyes that had seen too much in 8 months of life. "Today," she whispered to him. "One more day. That's all I'm asking." He blinked. His hand found her finger and held on. Grace moved through the morning like a woman walking through a minefield. Every step deliberate, every word measured. She cleaned the kitchen, prepared Nathan's bottles, tasting each one herself, before feeding him a precaution she'd started after last night and kept him strapped to her body in a carrier she'd found in the nursery closet. He wasn't leaving her arms. Not today. Not for a single second. Vivian came downstairs at 9, dressed in white linen hair, falling in soft waves, looking like a woman in a magazine advertisement for the kind of life most people only dreamed about. "Good morning," Vivian said, pouring herself coffee. She glanced at Nathan, strapped to Grace's chest, and raised an eyebrow. "That's a bit much, don't you think? He's not going to fall off the earth." "He likes being close," Grace said. "He likes being held because you've conditioned him to need it. That's not healthy, Grace. It's codependency." Grace didn't respond. She wiped down the counter and moved to the next task. Vivian watched her for a long moment, coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. "You're quiet today." "Just tired, ma'am." Vivian sipped her coffee. "You know, I've been thinking, maybe we should bring in a professional nanny, someone with actual credentials. Not that you haven't been wonderful, but Nathan needs structure. A routine designed by someone with training." "That's Mr. Calloway's decision. It's my decision, too. I'm going to be his stepmother." The word hung in the air. Stepmother. Grace felt it land in her chest like a stone. Vivian wasn't just positioning herself to control Nathan. She was positioning herself to replace every barrier between her and Edward's fortune. And Nathan, the biological heir, the son who would inherit everything, was the one obstacle she couldn't charm or manipulate away. He had to be removed. Slowly, carefully, in a way that looked like tragedy rather than murder. Grace understood it with sickening clarity. The storage room, the sedatives, the escalating abuse. Vivian wasn't losing her temper. She was building a narrative. A fragile baby with health problems, a neglectful maid, a series of unfortunate accidents that would eventually end in one final, irreversible accident. And when it was over, Vivian would cry the most beautiful tears anyone had ever seen. And Edward would hold her and no one would ever question the woman who had lost her stepson. Grace tightened the carrier strap and kept cleaning. At 10:30, she made a call from the staff bathroom with the door locked and the faucet running. "Dr. Simmons's office, how can I help you?" "This is Grace Thompson calling from the Callaway residence. I need Dr. Simmons to come to the house this evening, 6:30. It's regarding Nathan." "Is the baby all right?" "No," Grace said. "He's not. And I need the doctor to bring a toxicology kit." Silence on the line. Then, "I'll relay the message to Dr. Simmons directly. Thank you. And please don't call the house line. Call my cell." She hung up and stared at herself in the mirror. Her eyes were bloodshot. Her uniform was wrinkled. She looked like what she was, a woman running on fear and fury, and the refusal to let a child die in a rich man's house. The afternoon was the hardest. Vivian hovered. She drifted through the house like smoke appearing in doorways, lingering in hallways, always just close enough to watch Grace without seeming to. Twice, she tried to take Nathan. "Let me hold him for a bit," Vivian said the first time, reaching for the carrier. "He just fell asleep," Grace said. "If I move him, he'll wake up." Vivian's hand withdrew. Her smile stayed. "You're very protective today." "I'm always protective, ma'am." The second time, Vivian was more direct. "Grace, I need to feed him. Hand him over." "I already fed him at noon. He won't be hungry until 2:30. "I said hand him over." Grace met her eyes. "No, ma'am." The word dropped between them like a grenade. Vivian's face went still. Not angry, not surprised. Something worse, amused. "No," Vivian repeated softly. "He's comfortable. He's sleeping. Moving him will upset him. You just told me no. I told you what's best for the baby." Vivian stepped closer. Close enough that Grace could smell her perfume, could see the faint lines at the corners of her eyes that her makeup couldn't quite hide, could feel the cold coming off her like winter through an open window. "You know what I think?" Vivian said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think you've forgotten who you are. You're the help, Grace. You scrub toilets and wash sheets. You don't get to tell me no. You don't get to keep my fiancé's son strapped to your chest like he belongs to you. And you certainly don't get to look at me the way you're looking at me right now." Grace didn't blink. "And how am I looking at you?" "Like you think you've won something." "I'm looking at you like a woman who knows the truth." Vivian's composure cracked, just a fraction. A twitch at the corner of her mouth, a flash in her eyes that was pure, undiluted hatred. Then it was gone, smoothed over, plastered with that perfect smile. "We'll see," Vivian said pleasantly. "We'll see who the truth protects." She walked away. Grace exhaled and realized her whole body was trembling. Nathan stirred against her chest, whimpered once, then settled. She placed her hand on his back and felt his heartbeat fast, strong, alive. "Almost there," she whispered. "Almost there." At 5:45, Grace heard Edward's car in the driveway. She was in the nursery changing Nathan, her notebook open on the desk beside her. Helen had texted 20 minutes earlier. "Everything's in the study. Doctor confirmed for 6:30. Child welfare officer will arrive at the same time. I told them what we have." Grace closed the notebook and slid it into her bag. She picked up Nathan, held him against her shoulder, and walked downstairs. Edward was in the foyer setting down his briefcase. He looked up when Grace appeared. "How was he today?" Edward asked. "Sir, can I speak with you in the study?" "Now." Edward frowned. "Can it wait? I just walked in." "No, sir, it can't." Something in her voice, the weight of it, the steel underneath, made him stop. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right." They walked to the study. Helen was already there, standing near the desk with a manila folder in one hand and a tablet in the other. Edward stopped in the doorway. "Helen, what's going on?" "Sit down, Mr. Callaway," Helen said. "Someone tell me what's happening." "Please sit down," Grace said. Edward looked between the two women. His jaw tightened. He sat behind his desk. Helen placed the folder in front of him. Sir, what I'm about to show you is going to be difficult. But every piece of information in this folder has been verified, time-stamped, and backed up in 3 separate locations. Helen, you're scaring me. You should be scared, Grace said quietly from the doorway. Your son is in danger. Edward's face went pale. From who? Helen opened the folder. 3 months of biometric access logs for the storage wing. Every entry, every fingerprint, every timestamp. She pointed to the highlighted rows. Vivian Ashford accessed the storage wing 43 times in the past 6 weeks, always at night, always between 10 p.m. and 2 a.m. Edward stared at the page. That doesn't mean your fingerprint doesn't appear once. Helen continued. Mine doesn't appear once. Grace's doesn't appear once. Only Vivian's. Edward picked up the page. His hand was shaking. The night Nathan was locked in the storage room. Helen said the security cameras in that wing were manually disabled using the override code. The code was entered at 8:52 p.m. The cameras went dark at 8:55 p.m. and weren't restored until 5 a.m. the next morning. Who entered the code? 3 people have it. You, me, and Vivian. You were in your study. Grace brought you coffee at 9. I was off-site, logged out of the system. That leaves 1 person. Edward set the page down. His breathing had changed, shallow, uneven, the breathing of a man whose foundation was crumbling. Grace stepped forward. Sir, there's more. More? Helen pulled up a file on the tablet. Household purchase records. 3 weeks ago, Vivian ordered low-dose infant sedatives from a medical supply company. She used the house credit card. The order was delivered to the main gate. I signed for it myself. I assumed it was baby supplies. I didn't check. Edward stood up so fast his chair hit the wall behind him. Sedatives. Nathan has no medical procedures scheduled, Helen said. I confirmed with Dr. Simmons's office. There's no legitimate reason for those sedatives to be in this house. Last night, Grace said, her voice shaking now despite everything she did to hold it steady. I stepped out of the nursery for 30 seconds to get a towel. When I came back, Nathan's bottle had been moved. He drank the rest of it and fell asleep within minutes. Hard. Too hard. His arms went limp. His pulse was slow. He didn't wake up for hours, and when he did, he was disoriented and terrified. Edward pressed both hands flat on the desk. His knuckles were white. You're telling me she drugged my son? Dr. Simmons is on his way with a toxicology kit, Grace said. He'll be here in 20 minutes. If there's anything in Nathan's system, we'll know tonight. Edward's face contorted. Grace watched him cycle through disbelief, anger, horror, and something worse, guilt. The guilt of a man who had trusted the wrong person and was only now understanding the cost. The bruises, Edward whispered. The ones you kept telling me about. Grace nodded. I photographed everyone. Dates, times, locations on his body. They're in the folder. Edward opened the folder again. His hands moved through the pages, photographs of Nathan's arm, his thigh, his ribs. Small marks. Easy to dismiss individually. Devastating when laid out in sequence. Oh God, Edward said. He sat back down. His head dropped into his hands. Oh God, oh God. The front door opened, heels on marble. Vivian's voice floated down the hallway. Edward. Are you home? I thought we could try that new restaurant tonight. Edward looked up. His eyes were red. He looked at Grace, then at Helen. How long until the doctor gets here? 15 minutes, Helen said. Keep her here, Edward said. Don't let her leave. Vivian appeared in the study doorway, smiling, a glass of wine in her hand. The smile faltered when she saw Helen, then vanished completely when she saw the folder open on the desk and the photograph spread across it. What is this? She asked. Come in, Edward said. His voice was different. Flat. Controlled. The voice of a man who had made deals worth billions and ended careers with a phone call. Close the door. Vivian looked at Grace. at Nathan in Grace's arms, at Helen standing rigid by the desk. She walked in slowly, closed the door, and sat down in the chair across from Edward. "What's going on, darling?" she asked, but the warmth was gone. She could feel it, the shift in the room, the weight of what was already set in motion. 43 times, Edward said. "What? You accessed the storage wing 43 times in 6 weeks. At night. After midnight." He pushed the printout across the desk. "Your fingerprint, your timestamps, 43 entries." Vivian glanced at the page. Her jaw tightened. "I was checking on the holiday decorations. We have the benefit gala coming up. I wanted to inventory at 2 in the morning. I'm a night owl, you know that." "You disabled the security cameras." Vivian's hand tightened on her wine glass. "That's ridiculous." The override code was entered at 8:52 p.m. the night Nathan was locked in that room. "I was in my study. Helen was off-site. That leaves you." "Someone could have used my code. Anyone could have." "It's biometric, Vivian. Fingerprint, not a code. Your finger. On the panel. At 8:52 p.m. Vivian set the wine glass down. Her hand was steady. Grace noticed that. Even now, with the walls closing in her hand, was perfectly steady. "Edward, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding," Vivian said smoothly. "And I think I know who's behind it." She turned to Grace. "She's been building this for days. Planting evidence, manipulating. You bought infant sedatives." The words stopped Vivian mid-sentence. Her mouth stayed open for a fraction of a second before she closed it. "What?" she said. 3 weeks ago, medical supply company, house credit card, low-dose infant sedatives." Edward's voice cracked. "My son has no medical procedures scheduled. Why did you buy sedatives for a baby?" "I didn't." Helen stepped forward and placed the purchase receipt on the desk. Credit card number, billing address, Vivian Ashford's name, delivery signature, date. "That's not mine," Vivian said. "Someone used my card. Grace has access to the household accounts she could have." "She doesn't," Helen interrupted. "Staff accounts are separate. I verified that this morning." Vivian's composure was cracking. Not shattering, she was too disciplined for that, but cracking the way ice cracks before it breaks. Grace could see it in her eyes, the rapid calculations, the search for an exit that wasn't there. The doorbell rang. Helen left to answer it. She returned moments later with Dr. Simmons, a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and steady hands, and a younger woman in a dark blazer, Detective Patricia Lowe from Child Protective Services. "What is this?" Vivian stood up. "Edward, why is there a detective in our house?" "Sit down, Vivian." "I will not sit down. This is an ambush. You brought a doctor and a detective into our home without telling me. Based on what? The word of a maid." "Based on evidence," Edward said. "Sit down." Vivian sat. Her chin lifted. Her eyes hardened. Dr. Simmons approached Grace. "May I examine him?" Grace handed Nathan over carefully. The baby fussed, reaching back toward her, but Dr. Simmons was gentle and quick. He checked Nathan's reflexes, his pupils, his muscle tone. He rolled up the baby's sleeves and examined his arms, his legs, his torso. "These marks on his ribs," Dr. Simmons said quietly. "When did they appear?" 2 days ago, Grace said. "The ones on his arm appeared 4 days ago." "And the lethargy you described on the phone?" "Last night. He fell asleep too quickly, too deeply. His arms were limp. His pulse was slow. He woke up disoriented and scared." Dr. Simmons looked at Edward. "I'd like to run a rapid toxicology screen, with your permission." "Do it," Edward said. Vivian stood up again. "You are not drawing blood from that baby based on accusations from the cleaning lady." "I'm his father," Edward said. "I'm giving consent. Sit down or leave the room." Vivian's mouth opened, closed. She sat. Dr. Simmons drew a small blood sample from Nathan's heel. The baby cried a sharp, honest cry of pain that was somehow less terrible than the quiet, drugged silence of the night before. Grace held his hand through it, murmuring comfort. "I'll have preliminary results within the hour," Dr. Simmons said. "But based on his pupil response and motor reflexes, I'm seeing indicators consistent with recent sedative exposure." Edward made a sound, not a word, not a cry, something raw and broken that came from a place deeper than language. Detective Lowe had been silent until now. She stepped forward. "Ms. Ashford, I need to ask you some questions." "I'm not answering anything without a lawyer." "That's your right. But I want you to know that we have biometric access records placing you in the storage wing at the time of the incident, purchase records for infant sedatives under your name, and photographic documentation of injuries to the child spanning 4 days. We also have this." Helen stepped forward with her phone. She pressed play. Vivian's voice filled the room, captured through the air vent recorded by the security system's audio backup that Helen had quietly activated 3 days ago. "Once she's gone, he'll stop crying, and if he doesn't, I'll finish it." The room went dead silent. Vivian's face changed, not gradually, all at once. The mask didn't crack, it disintegrated. The warmth, the charm, the practiced vulnerability, the concerned fiancée, the loving stepmother, all of it fell away, and what was left was something cold and bare and furious. "That's taken out of context," Vivian said, but her voice was shaking now. Helen played another recording. Vivian's voice again, this time from last night outside Grace's door. "You should have stayed in your lane, Grace. You clean floors. You fold towels. That's what you are. That's all you'll ever be." And then the words that made Edward close his eyes. "That child is a complication I never agreed to." Edward opened his eyes. They were wet. He looked at Vivian. Really looked at her perhaps for the first time and said 2 words. "Get out." Vivian didn't move. "Edward, listen to me. You're being manipulated. She's turned your own staff against you. This is exactly what she wanted, to isolate you, to make you dependent on her to take your son." "You locked my son in a storage room," Edward said, his voice breaking. "You drugged him. You bruised him. You stood in this house and smiled at me while you hurt my child." "He's not even mine," Vivian snapped. "He's the leftovers of your dead wife. You think I wanted to raise another woman's baby? You think that's what I signed up for?" The cruelty of the words hit the room like a shockwave. Edward recoiled, as if she'd struck him. Grace pulled Nathan closer. Dr. Simmons looked away. Helen stood rigid, jaw set. Detective Lowe spoke calmly. "Ms. Ashford, I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of child abuse and endangerment. You have the right to remain silent." "Don't touch me," Vivian hissed, backing toward the door. "Do you know who I am? Do you know what I can do?" "Edward, tell them. Tell them this is a mistake." Edward didn't speak. He stared at the desk, at the photographs of his son's bruises, at the purchase receipt for drugs meant to sedate an 8-month-old baby, and he said nothing. "Edward!" Vivian screamed. 2 officers entered the study. They'd been waiting in the hallway. Helen had arranged it. They moved toward Vivian, and for the first time her control shattered completely. She fought, she screamed, she kicked at the officers and clawed at the doorframe as they pulled her through it. She screamed Edward's name, then Grace's, then words that weren't words anymore, just rage, raw and shapeless, the sound of a person stripped of every mask they'd ever worn. "That child ruined everything," she shrieked as they pulled her down the hallway. "He was never supposed to exist. None of this was supposed to happen." Nathan buried his face in Grace's chest and sobbed. Not the panicked, choking sobs of the past week. Something different. Something that sounded almost like relief, the way a person cries when the thing they've been afraid of is finally impossibly over. "Shh," Grace murmured, rocking him. "It's done. She's gone. You're safe." The front door opened. Vivian's screams echoed off the driveway, the walls, the night air. Then the car door closed. The engine started. The sirens didn't wail. They didn't need to. The car pulled away slowly, deliberately, carrying Vivian Ashford out of the Calloway mansion and out of Nathan's life. The house went quiet. Not the dangerous quiet. Not the pressing, suffocating quiet that had filled these walls for weeks. A different kind. The kind that comes after a storm has passed, and the air is clean, and the ground is wet, and everything is still standing. Edward sat at his desk for a long time. Grace stood near the window, Nathan sleeping against her shoulder, his breathing deep and even and real, not drugged, not frightened, just the honest exhaustion of a baby who had fought to survive and finally could stop fighting. Helen collected the folder, the tablet, the printouts. She placed a flash drive on the desk in front of Edward. "Everything's on here," she said. "For the case." Edward nodded without looking up. Helen walked to the door. She paused beside Grace and put a hand on her shoulder. One squeeze. No words. Then she left. Grace and Edward were alone. Nathan sighed in his sleep. "I almost lost him," Edward said. His voice was hollow, stripped of everything except the truth. "Because of her. Because of me." Grace didn't answer right away. She let the silence hold the weight of what he'd said. Then she spoke. "You didn't lose him." Edward looked up. His eyes were red, his face drawn, his hands still trembling on the desk. "You didn't lose him," Grace repeated. "He's right here. He's breathing. He's alive. And that's what matters now." Edward pressed his hands to his face. His shoulders shook once, twice, and then he was still. Nathan stirred. His eyes fluttered open, found Grace's face, and his tiny hand reached up to touch her cheek. "Mama," he whispered. Grace closed her eyes and let the words settle into her chest, into the place where Maya's name still lived, where grief and love had shared a room for 7 years. "I'm here," she said. "I'm right here." The first night without Vivian in the house was the quietest Grace had ever known. Not the dangerous quiet, the kind that had pressed against her ears for weeks, the kind that hid footsteps and whispered threats, and the slow, deliberate cruelty of a woman who smiled while she hurt a child. This was different. This was the quiet of aftermath. The quiet of a held breath finally released. Grace sat in the nursery with Nathan in her arms. She hadn't put him down since the officers had taken Vivian away. She wasn't ready to. Some part of her still expected the footsteps in the hallway, the soft knock, the whispered threats through the door. Her body hadn't caught up to the truth yet. Her mind knew it was over, but her muscles, her pulse, the tightness in her chest, those things needed more time. Nathan slept deeply. Not the drugged heavy sleep of the past few nights, real sleep. The kind where his eyelids fluttered, and his fingers twitched, and his lips moved around sounds that weren't quite words. The kind of sleep a baby was supposed to have. The kind Grace hadn't seen since before she'd found him in that storage room. She held him and listened to the house settle. No heels on hardwood. No whispered plans through the vents. No handle turning slowly in the dark. Just the hum of the heating system, the distant tick of a clock, and Nathan's breathing steady, even alive. At some point, Grace realized she was crying. Not sobbing, not breaking down. Just tears rolling silently down her cheeks, dripping onto Nathan's blanket. She didn't wipe them away. She let them come. They had earned their way out. She thought about Maya. She always thought about Maya. Her daughter's face was the first thing she saw when she woke up, and the last thing she saw before she fell asleep, and in the years since Maya's death, Grace had learned to carry that face with her, the way other people carried wallets or keys, always present, always necessary, always heavy. But tonight, sitting in this nursery with someone else's child pressed against her chest, the weight felt different. Not lighter. Not gone. Just shared. As if Nathan's small body had absorbed some of it, not by taking it away, but by giving Grace a reason to keep carrying it forward instead of sinking under it. "You would have liked him," Grace whispered to the empty room, to the daughter who wasn't there. "He's stubborn. Like you. Nathan sighed in his sleep. Grace closed her eyes. She didn't sleep, but she rested. And for the first time in 12 years, resting didn't feel like giving up. Edward didn't come out of his study until morning. Grace heard him moving around 6 a.m. The creak of his chair, the clink of a glass, footsteps pacing back and forth across the hardwood. When he finally appeared in the nursery doorway, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single night. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes swollen, his jaw shadowed with stubble he hadn't bothered to shave. He stood in the doorway and looked at Nathan for a long time without speaking. "Did he sleep?" Edward finally asked. "All night," Grace said. "No waking, no screaming. First time." Edward nodded. He opened his mouth closed, it opened it again. Whatever he was trying to say kept getting stuck somewhere between his chest and his throat. "I keep thinking about the storage room," he said. "That first night, when you found him, you broke the glass with your elbow. You didn't even hesitate. I heard him crying. And I didn't." Edward's voice cracked. "I was in my bedroom with her, 50 feet away, and I didn't hear a thing." "The walls are thick, sir." "Don't do that, Grace. Don't make excuses for me." He stepped into the room and sat down on the small ottoman near the window. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. "I brought her into this house. I gave her access to my son. I let her sleep next to me while she was locking my child in a dark room. And when you tried to tell me, when you stood in my study and begged me to listen, I told you to be careful." Grace said nothing. She let him talk. He needed to. "Be careful," Edward repeated bitterly. "I said that to you, like you were the threat. Like the woman who'd worked in my home for 12 years, who raised 3 children, who found my son dying in a storage room, like you were the one I needed to worry about. You trusted her. I was blind. You loved her. That's not the same thing." Edward looked up. His eyes were red and raw. "How can you say that, after everything she did, after everything I failed to do?" Grace adjusted Nathan in her arms. He stirred, nuzzled closer, settled. "Because anger at yourself doesn't help him. And that's all that matters now. Him." Edward stared at her for a long moment. Then he exhaled a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to empty him completely. "The detective called this morning," he said. "They found more. On Vivian's phone. Messages to someone, a man they don't know who yet. Talking about Nathan. About how to handle him. About timing." Grace's stomach turned. Timing for what? They think she was planning something permanent. The sedatives were just the beginning. The detective said if you hadn't intervened when you did, if you hadn't started documenting, if Helen hadn't pulled those logs, they estimate Nathan had days, maybe a week. The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She held Nathan tighter, pressing her lips to the top of his head, breathing him in. "Baby shampoo, clean cotton, life." "Days," she whispered. "Days." They sat in silence for a long time after that. The morning sun moved across the floor of the nursery, slow and golden, touching the walls with warmth that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and they just hadn't been able to feel it under the weight of everything else. Finally, Edward spoke again. "The child welfare officer, Detective Lowe, she's coming back this afternoon. She wants to do a formal assessment of Nathan, of the house, of our care arrangements." "All right." "She told me something on the phone. She said that in cases like this, when a child has been traumatized, they look for what they call a primary attachment figure. The person the child associates with safety. The person they reach for when they're afraid." Grace knew where this was going. She said Nathan's primary attachment figure is you. Not me. You. Edward's voice was steady, but his eyes glistened. "He reaches for you. He calms when he hears your voice. He says your name, the only word he knows, Mama." "Sir." "Let me finish." Edward sat up straight. "I'm his father. I love him more than anything in this world, but I wasn't the one who found him. I wasn't the one who fed him through the night, who checked his body for bruises, who slept on the floor with her back against the wall to keep him safe. I wasn't the one who said no to Vivian Ashford when she tried to take him. That was you." Grace's eyes burned. She blinked hard. "Detective Lowe recommended that Nathan stay in your primary care during the investigation and transition period. She said it could be weeks, maybe months. She suggested making it official, a legal guardianship arrangement. Documented. Protected. I'm a maid, Mr. Calloway." "No." Edward shook his head. "You're not. Not anymore. Not since the moment you put your elbow through that glass." Nathan opened his eyes. He looked up at Grace, then turned his head and saw Edward. For a moment, the baby was still studying his father with those dark, knowing eyes. Then he reached out one small hand toward Edward. Edward's composure broke. He leaned forward and let Nathan's fingers wrap around his. The baby held on grip tight and made a small sound. Not a word, not a cry, just a sound. The sound of a child deciding slowly, carefully, to trust again. "Hey, buddy," Edward whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Nathan pulled Edward's finger closer, examined it with intense concentration, then brought it to his mouth and gummed it thoughtfully. It was such a normal, mundane baby thing to do that it cracked the tension in the room wide open. Grace laughed. It came out of nowhere, a short surprise sound that startled her as much as it startled Edward. He looked at her, and then he laughed too. Quiet, broken, but real. Nathan looked between them, confused by the noise, then smiled a wide, gummy, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "There it is," Grace said softly. "There he is." The days that followed moved slowly, but they moved in the right direction. Detective Lowe completed her assessment and recommended that Grace be designated as Nathan's primary caregiver with full legal authority. Edward signed every document without hesitation. A lawyer drew up a formal agreement, salary, benefits, living quarters, decision-making power over Nathan's health and daily care. Grace read every word twice before she signed. "You're sure about this?" she asked Edward in his study, the contract spread on the desk between them. "I've never been more sure of anything. This gives me authority to override you. On medical decisions, on his routine, on who can and can't see him." "I know what it says. I had my lawyer write it that way." Grace studied his face. "Why?" Edward leaned back in his chair. "Because I didn't listen the first time. And I won't put Nathan in a position where someone has to fight to protect him again. If you see something wrong, you act. You don't ask, you don't wait. You act. That's what this contract guarantees." Grace signed it. Helen stayed on as head of security. She overhauled the entire system, new biometric protocols, mandatory camera coverage in every wing, audio monitoring in common areas, with consent from all staff. She hired 2 additional security officers and implemented a daily log review that she conducted personally each morning. "Overkill?" Grace asked her one afternoon, passing her in the hallway. Helen didn't smile. "Ask me that question again in 5 years. If nothing's happened, I'll tell you it was overkill. Until then, it's the minimum." Grace respected that. She understood it. Both of them had learned the same lesson in this house, that danger didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wore silk dresses and expensive perfume and kissed you on the cheek before it tried to destroy everything you loved. The staff changed too. Not all at once, but gradually, like a house learning to breathe again after holding its breath for too long. Doors that had been closed stayed open. Conversations that had been whispered returned to normal volume. The cook started playing music in the kitchen again, something she'd stopped doing when Vivian moved in because Vivian had said it was distracting. Grace moved out of the staff quarters and into the guest suite adjacent to the nursery. Edward had it renovated in 3 days, new furniture, a private bathroom, a small sitting area with a window that overlooked the garden. It was the nicest room Grace had ever lived in, And the first night she slept there, she lay awake for an hour, simply because the bed was too comfortable, and her body didn't know what to do with comfort anymore. Nathan's crib was 5 steps from her bed. She counted them every night before she turned off the light. 5 steps. Close enough to hear him breathe. Close enough to reach him in the dark. Close enough that he would never again wake up alone. Dr. Simmons came twice a week for the first month. The toxicology results confirmed what they already knew: trace amounts of a sedative in Nathan's bloodstream, consistent with repeated low-dose administration over a period of approximately 2 weeks. The bruises healed. The weight returned. His appetite stabilized. His sleep normalized. But the real changes were smaller than blood work and weight charts. Nathan stopped flinching at sudden sounds. He stopped going rigid when someone entered the room. He stopped crying with that sharp, panicked wail that had haunted Grace's sleep for weeks. Instead, he cried the way babies were supposed to cry: when he was hungry, when he was tired, when he wanted to be held. Normal cries. Healthy cries. Healthy. The kind that meant his body trusted the world enough to ask it for things. He crawled for the first time on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after Vivian's arrest. Grace was in the nursery folding laundry when she heard a shuffling sound behind her. She turned around and found Nathan halfway across the floor, arms pumping, knees sliding on the carpet, determination written across his entire face. "Oh my God," Grace said, dropping the laundry. "Oh my God, look at you." She knelt down and held out her hands. Nathan looked at her, grinned his gummy grin, and crawled straight to her. He grabbed her knees and pulled himself up, swaying on unsteady legs, laughing with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child who had just discovered he could move. Grace scooped him up and held him overhead. He shrieked with delight, kicking his feet, reaching for her face. "You did it," she said, pulling him close. "You did it, baby. I knew you could." She called Edward at the office. He answered on the first ring. "He crawled," Grace said. Silence. Then Edward's voice, thick and unsteady. "He crawled. Across the whole nursery floor, straight to me. Don't let him stop. I'm leaving now. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He made it in 15. Grace had never seen a billionaire run through his own house, but Edward Calloway ran. He burst into the nursery, tie-flying briefcase abandoned in the hallway, and dropped to his knees on the carpet. "Show me, buddy," he said, his voice trembling. "Show Dad." Grace set Nathan on the carpet. The baby looked at Edward, looked at Grace, then looked at the distance between them, about 8 feet of open floor, and took off. Not gracefully, not quickly, but forward, moving, living. Edward caught him at the other end and lifted him high, laughing and crying, at the same time, this powerful man undone by a baby's first crawl. "That's my boy," Edward whispered, pressing his forehead to Nathan's. "That's my boy." Grace watched from across the room. She didn't move. She didn't need to. Some moments were meant to be witnessed, not entered. The case against Vivian moved through the courts over the following months. Grace didn't follow it closely. She knew the broad strokes: multiple charges of child abuse and endangerment, evidence of premeditation, the messages on Vivian's phone that revealed a calculated plan to harm Nathan, and eventually gain sole control of Edward's estate. The man Vivian had been messaging was identified as a former boyfriend who had helped her research methods of harm that could appear accidental. He was arrested too. Vivian's lawyer tried to build a defense around mental health postpartum stress from becoming a stepmother. Anxiety, emotional instability. The judge didn't buy it. Neither did the jury. The sedatives alone were enough. The biometric logs sealed it. The audio recordings buried it. Grace was called to testify once. She wore her best dress, a navy blue one she'd bought for Maya's funeral 7 years ago, and hadn't worn since. She sat in the witness stand and told the truth. She told them about the storage room, the crying, the shattered glass, the baby in the plastic crate. She told them about the bruises and the cut diapers and the planted bottles. She told them about the formula container, the sedatives, the footsteps outside her door at midnight. She told them about Vivian's whispered threats, "Enjoy it while it lasts," and about the recording that said, "I'll finish it." She didn't cry on the stand. She'd done all her crying in the dark alone, holding a baby who needed her to be stronger than she felt. She had nothing left to prove to anyone in that courtroom. The evidence spoke for itself. After her testimony, as she walked through the courthouse hallway, she passed Vivian being led in the opposite direction by two officers. They were 10 feet apart when their eyes met. Vivian looked different, smaller. No makeup, no styled hair, no silk dress. Just a woman in an orange jumpsuit with hollow eyes and tight lips. She stared at Grace with the same cold calculation she'd always had, but now it was impotent, a weapon without ammunition. Grace held her gaze for 3 seconds. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had been said by a baby, pointing his tiny hand at the woman who hurt him. Grace turned and walked away. Vivian was convicted on all charges. The sentence was severe. Grace didn't memorize the number of years. The number didn't matter. What mattered was that Vivian Ashford would never again stand in a nursery doorway, would never again whisper threats through a locked door, would never again touch Nathan Calloway. That was enough. Months passed. The mansion transformed. Not physically. The walls were the same. The floors were the same. The glass and marble and polished surfaces remained exactly where they'd always been. But the feeling changed. Warmth crept into corners that had been cold. Noise returned, not tense muted noise, but real noise. Laughter. Music. Nathan's voice growing louder and more confident every day, babbling streams of sounds that were slowly becoming words. His first real word beyond mama was more. He said it at the breakfast table, banging his spoon on his high chair tray, demanding another spoonful of mashed banana. Grace gave it to him. He said it again. She gave him another. He said it a third time louder, and she laughed so hard she had to set the spoon down. "You're going to eat me out of house and home," she told him. "More," he said firmly. His second word was up. His third was no. His fourth, to everyone's surprise and Edward's immense pride, was Dad. Edward was sitting on the nursery floor playing blocks with Nathan when the baby looked at him, pointed at his face, and said it. Clear. Unmistakable. "Dad?" Edward went very still. Then he picked Nathan up, held him against his chest, and closed his eyes. Grace watched from the doorway. She didn't interrupt. She smiled and walked quietly back to the kitchen. One evening, months later, Grace stood in the garden while Nathan played on the grass nearby, grabbing fistfuls of clover and offering them to her with the grave generosity of a child who believes everything he touches is a gift worth giving. Edward joined them. He stood beside Grace and watched his son for a while without speaking. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "About what?" "About what you said to me the morning after they took Vivian away. I asked you how you could forgive me for not listening, and you said anger at myself doesn't help him." "I remember." "You were right, but I want you to know I haven't forgiven myself, not because I'm punishing myself, because I want to remember. I want to remember what it costs when you trust the wrong person and doubt the right one. I want that memory to stay sharp, so I never make that mistake again." Grace nodded. "That's fair." "There's something else." He turned to face her. "I never thanked you properly. You gave me a contract, a room, a salary, and legal authority over your son. That's pretty proper." "That's compensation. It's not gratitude." He paused. "You saved his life, Grace. You broke through glass and put your body between my son and the person trying to kill him. You did that with no power, no leverage, no guarantee that anyone would believe you. You did it because it was right." Grace looked at Nathan on the grass. He had discovered a ladybug on a clover leaf and was staring at it with the focused intensity of a scientist making a breakthrough discovery. "I did it because he was crying," Grace said simply, "and nobody else heard him." Edward was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I hear him now. I know you do. Nathan looked up from his ladybug-spotted Grace and broke into a run, the unsteady, joyful, arms-wide run of a toddler who has somewhere important to be. He crashed into Grace's legs and held on laughing. Mama bug. I see it, baby. Show me. He grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the clover patch, talking in the half-language of a child, on the edge of real speech, narrating a world that was finally after everything safe enough to explore. Grace let herself be pulled. She let the grass tickle her bare feet and the evening sun warm her face and her son, because that's what he was in every way that mattered. Show her a ladybug on a leaf as if it were the most important thing in the universe. And in that moment, it was. Later that night, after Nathan was asleep, Grace walked through the quiet house alone. She moved through the hallways she'd cleaned for 12 years, past the kitchen, where she'd prepared 1,000 meals, past the study where Edward had almost let the truth slip away, past the staff room where a dirty bottle had been planted to destroy her credibility. She stopped at the storage wing. The door stood open. Helen had ordered it kept open permanently. No locks, no restrictions, full camera coverage at all times. The room where Nathan had been found was empty, now cleaned out, the plastic holiday crate removed and destroyed. Grace stepped inside. She stood in the center of the room and looked around. It was just a room. 4 walls, a concrete floor, a single overhead light. Nothing special, nothing dangerous. Just a room. But she could still hear it faintly, like an echo trapped in the walls, the sound of a baby crying in the dark. The sound that had changed everything. The sound that had pulled her off her cleaning route and into the fight of her life. She closed her eyes and let the memory pass through her. The shattering glass. The cold air. The tiny shivering body in the crate. The fingers gripping her uniform. The first time he called her mama. Then she opened her eyes, turned around, and walked out. She didn't look back. Some doors were meant to be left open so the light could get in. Others were meant to be walked through one final time and never entered again. Grace knew the difference now. She'd earned it. She returned to the nursery, sat down in the chair beside Nathan's crib, and watched him sleep. His face was peaceful. His hands were open, palms up, fingers relaxed, the posture of a child who no longer needed to grip anything in his sleep because he finally believed the world wouldn't take it away. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook. She opened it to the last page, past the dates and times and bruise measurements, past the feeding schedules and incident reports, past the entry about Maya that she'd written in the dark on the worst night of her life. She picked up her pen and wrote one final entry. He's safe, he's loved, he's home. And so am I. She closed the notebook. She put it back in her bag. She turned off the lamp and sat in the darkness, listening to Nathan breathe, and let the silence hold her. Not the dangerous silence, not the silence of a house hiding its secrets, the silence of a home at peace. Grace Thompson had walked into this house 12 years ago as a maid. She had cleaned its floors, washed its linens, and made herself invisible because that was what survival required. She had buried her daughter's memory in routine and silence, and the discipline of showing up every single day, because stopping meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking, and breaking was something she could not afford. But when a baby cried in the dark, she didn't calculate the cost. She didn't weigh the risk. She didn't ask permission. She broke the glass, she opened the door, and she held on to that child with everything she had. Every ounce of love she'd been storing since Maya died. Every year of grief, she'd swallowed every moment of invisible courage that no one had ever asked her for, and she had given anyway. She saved him. Not with money, not with power, not with a name anyone would recognize. She saved him with the only thing she had, her hands, her instincts, her refusal to look away, and a love so fierce it terrified the woman who thought she could destroy it. Vivian Ashford had everything: beauty, wealth, charm, access, a plan. Grace Thompson had nothing but the truth and the willingness to fight for it. And in the end, nothing beat everything. Because courage doesn't come from privilege. It comes from the place inside you that says, "Not this child. Not on my watch. Not while I'm still breathing." Nathan Calloway would grow up knowing that. He would grow up knowing that when the world locked him in the dark, a woman with scarred hands and a broken heart broke down the door. He would grow up knowing that the word mama didn't belong to blood. It belonged to whoever answered when he cried. And Grace Thompson, the maid, the mother, the woman who refused to be invisible when it mattered most, would spend the rest of her life making sure he never had to cry alone again. That was the promise she made the night she found him. And it was a promise she intended to keep for as long as she lived. Not because anyone asked her to, because that's what love does. It doesn't wait for permission. It breaks the glass and opens the door. Every single time.